The odds are that if you've decided to watch this course, you probably already have an inkling of what punctuation is. But I thought it might be useful to start out a course on punctuation by defining it. So let's look at a few simple definitions of punctuation so we have a base to start from. First, the classic definition of punctuation is that punctuation is a set of marks that regulates and clarifies the meaning of text by linking or separating words, phrases, or clauses within that text. So it segments text into meaningful clauses and phrases. It also allows you to insert pauses and breaths. It says where the breaths should be if your text is being read out loud. So let's take a little bit closer look at this separation and insertion of pauses. First, let's look at using punctuation to separate your writing into phrases and complete thoughts. You use full stops, which includes the period, question mark, and exclamation mark, to separate complete thoughts into sentences. This that I've just written on the screen is a sentence. It begins with an uppercase letter and ends with a period, one of the 3 full stops. And it's a complete thought. Use commas to separate sentences into introductions, parenthetical asides, lists, and conclusions. Now, you don't know what those 4 things are, but those are the only 4 things that we're going to use commas for. And commas are going to be your most used punctuation. And another example of joining text is that you use double quotes to enclose your dialogue, so to define what part of your text is being spoken by a character. Now let's look at using punctuation to insert pauses. This is the way I like to look at it. If we have 2 words separated by a space, there's no pause. So this first line shows that example. We have word and word separated by a space. Now, if we separate word and word by comma space, then suddenly we have a short pause. I walk to the store, comma, a little pause, and then something else is said. If we separate 2 words by a semicolon, that looks like a colon with a period over it, and a space, that's a longer pause. Longer yet is the full stop, which includes the period, question mark, and exclamation mark. I'm showing a period example here. Word, period, space, space. Word. This is a long pause. It's a break between complete thoughts. And you give it a longer pause if you're reading it out loud or in your mind. And then finally, there's a paragraph break where we go along and we have word, period, and then we start a new line indicating that we're starting a new paragraph. That's the longest pause of all. That's a break in a set of sentences or complete thoughts. So you can see that you can use punctuation to insert pauses into your writing. Now let's take a look at how these pauses sound with this simple sample of punctuation pauses. In the beginning, comma, now there's a comma there, so there's going to be a pause. So listen to this. In the beginning, no one noticed that Steve was odd. Here's a semicolon. That's going to be even longer. So it goes, in the beginning, no one noticed that Steve was odd. Frankly, I doubt anyone cared. And a period, that's a long pause before we say, Stephen certainly didn't care. Period, new line. Now we're starting a new paragraph, so an even longer pause before we say, then there was Franklin to consider. So this shows you how the various punctuations introduce pauses. And they're introducing pauses by segmenting the sentences into chunks, or the text into sentences and chunks. During the remainder of this course, I'll define all 15 of the English punctuation marks, but I'll only be stressing 7 of them. The period, question mark, and exclamation mark are your 3 hard stops, your sentence terminators. Use the first by default, the second, the question mark, to ask a question, and the exclamation mark to make an emphatic, strong statement. Next comes the comma, the most heavily used punctuation, and that, once again, you use to separate a sentence into introductions, parenthetical asides, lists, and conclusions. Then we use the double quote to enclose dialogue. This is used primarily in fiction. The apostrophe is used to indicate possession or contraction, as in turning the word do not into don't, spelled D-O-N apostrophe T. And then finally, hyphens or hyphenation is used to combine words that are so closely related that they need to form a single word. Now, this brings me to my first rule of punctuation, and that is keep your punctuation simple. These 7 punctuation marks are the only marks with very few rules per that you need to write anything. And to tell you the truth, if I were you and I was brand new to punctuation, I would skip the remaining 8 punctuation marks, which are just icing on the cake, and I would focus on these 7. And with that said, we're ready to get to the next lecture, which is course resources. I'm going to list several useful resources on the net and in books and software and so on, which you'll like to have by your side as you're watching the course. I'll see you in that lecture.